The scorching sun beat down relentlessly on the rugged pass within the Sierra Morena mountains of Spain. It was the year 1808, and a column of French dragoons marched slowly along the dusty road. These men were part of the finest army in Europe, and they served Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of the continent. Yet in this desolate landscape they looked fearful and exhausted. They scanned the rocky cliffs above with anxious eyes. Suddenly a thunderous volley of musket fire erupted from the heights. Boulders crashed down onto the path and blocked their escape. Men in rough peasant clothing emerged from the shadows to fire point blank before vanishing into the terrain. This ambush was not a traditional battle fought between two lined armies on an open field. It was a brutal and chaotic assault that struck fear into the hearts of the French invaders. The soldiers of the Empire faced an enemy they could not see and could not catch. Every shadow in the Spanish countryside held a potential threat. The supply lines of the French army were cut and their communications were intercepted. What was supposed to be a simple conquest had turned into a nightmare. The stakes were nothing less than the stability of the French Empire. If the Spanish people could not be subdued, then Napoleon would bleed his resources dry. The men who fought in these mountains were not professional soldiers trained in academies. They were farmers and shepherds and shopkeepers who had taken up arms to defend their homes. They were led by charismatic local leaders who knew every cave and goat path in the region. These fighters did not wear uniforms or march in step. They fought with a desperation and ferocity that shocked the disciplined French troops. They were the embodiment of a new kind of warfare that would come to define conflicts for centuries to come. They were the original guerrilleros, and they were changing the rules of war. How could a ragtag force of poorly equipped civilians hope to defeat the most powerful military machine on earth? This question haunted the French generals who watched their regiments dissolve in the harsh Spanish terrain. The conventional wisdom of the time dictated that wars were won by capturing capital cities and destroying enemy armies in decisive battles. But here the enemy refused to offer a decisive battle. They melted away when pressed and attacked only when they held the advantage. Could the sheer will of a people overcome the might of an empire? The answer would reshape military history. The answer was a resounding yes, and the method was what we now call guerrilla warfare. The French occupation of Spain became known as the Spanish Ulcer because it slowly drained the strength of the empire. It proved that a smaller and weaker force could defeat a larger and stronger one by refusing to play by the rules of the strong. The immediate aftermath of the Peninsular War was a shattered myth of French invincibility. It inspired resistance movements across Europe and demonstrated that military might alone guarantees nothing. The tactics born in those mountains would echo through time. Guerrilla warfare is as old as conflict itself, but the term itself was coined during that bloody struggle in Spain. It translates literally to little war. It is the strategy of the underdog and the weapon of the oppressed. Throughout history, small bands of fighters have used the terrain and the support of the local population to harass and exhaust superior enemies. The core principle is simple: to avoid strength and strike weakness. Sun Tzu wrote about these concepts in The Art of War over 2,000 years ago. He emphasized speed and deception and the importance of knowing the enemy. Long before the Spanish peasants took up arms, the Roman Empire faced a similar frustration. During the Second Punic War, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca ravaged the Italian countryside. He destroyed every Roman army sent against him. The Roman general Quintus Fabius Maximus realized that he could not defeat Hannibal in a direct confrontation. Instead, he adopted a strategy of avoidance and delay. He shadowed the Carthaginian army and cut off their foraging parties to starve them out. He refused to give Hannibal the battle he sought. This became known as the Fabian strategy. The Fabian strategy was unpopular at the time because it was seen as cowardly by the Roman Senate. They wanted a glorious victory, but Fabius understood that survival was the ultimate victory. By preserving his army and wearing down the invader, he eventually turned the tide of the war. This historical example illustrates the patience required for asymmetric warfare. It is not about winning a single day, but about enduring long enough for the enemy to lose their will to fight. The weak must trade space for time and accept that the war will be long and painful. Fast forward to the 18th century and the forests of North America. The American Revolution serves as a prime example of how irregular tactics can aid a conventional war. While George Washington led the Continental Army in the North, a different kind of war was raging in the South. The British Army under Lord Cornwallis had captured Charleston and seemed poised to crush the rebellion in South Carolina. But they had not counted on the resilience of the local militia. Among these militia leaders was a man who would become a legend of guerrilla warfare. Character Bible, Francis Marion is a wiry and intense man in his late 40s with a weather-beaten face and sharp dark eyes. He wears a ragged blue Continental Army uniform coat over buckskin trousers and a leather tricorn hat with a white crescent badge. He carries a flintlock pistol and a saber. He is often seen riding a chestnut horse in a swampy environment. Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, operated in the treacherous wetlands of South Carolina. He led a band of irregulars who struck at British supply convoys and isolated outposts. Marion and his men knew the swamps better than anyone. They could launch a surprise attack and then vanish into the cypress trees and marshes where the British cavalry could not follow. His tactics were hit and run in their purest form. He never stayed in one camp for more than a night, and he kept his numbers small to remain undetected. The British officer Bannister Tarleton was sent to capture Marion, but he found the task impossible. After chasing Marion through miles of swamp, Tarleton reportedly gave up and cursed the old fox. This inability to catch the rebels demoralized the British troops and emboldened the Patriots. Marion did not win the war on his own, but he kept the spirit of resistance alive in the South when all hope seemed lost. His actions forced the British to divert thousands of troops to protect their rear and supply lines. By constantly harassing the British Army, Francis Marion and other partisan leaders like Thomas Sumter weakened Cornwallis significantly. The British could hold the towns, but they could not control the countryside. Every time they marched out of their fortifications, they risked ambush. This constant pressure contributed to the decision by Cornwallis to move to Yorktown, where he was eventually trapped and forced to surrender. The American victory was a combination of conventional strength and irregular harassment working in tandem. Returning to the 19th century, the Peninsular War in Spain formalized the concept of the guerrilla. The Spanish partisans were organized into bands that operated independently but shared a common goal. They were supported by the British Army under the Duke of Wellington, but they fought their own war. They made it impossible for a French messenger to travel without a heavy escort. A letter from Madrid to Paris might take weeks to arrive if it arrived at all. This disruption of communication paralyzed the French command. The psychological impact on the French soldiers was devastating. They felt surrounded by a hostile population. Any civilian could be a partisan in disguise. This fear led to brutal reprisals by the French, which only fueled the hatred of the Spanish people and swelled the ranks of the guerrillas. It was a vicious cycle that the French could not break. Napoleon later blamed the Spanish ulcer for his ultimate downfall. It was a clear lesson that a hostile population cannot be subdued by military force alone. In the American Civil War, the Confederacy utilized partisan rangers to disrupt Union operations. The most famous of these was John Singleton Mosby, known as the Gray Ghost. Mosby operated in northern Virginia and conducted daring raids behind Union lines. He captured high-ranking officers and stole supplies and destroyed railroads. His small force tied down tens of thousands of Union soldiers who were needed to guard Washington and the supply depots. Mosby proved that a small mobile force could have a strategic impact far beyond its numbers. Mosby utilized the support of the local population to survive. Civilians provided him with food and information and hiding places. He operated under a law passed by the Confederate Congress that authorized partisan ranger battalions. However, this type of warfare had a dark side. Union generals became frustrated and ordered harsh measures against civilians who supported Mosby. They burned barns and seized livestock in an attempt to deny the Rangers their base of support. This escalation is a common feature of counterinsurgency warfare. As the 20th century approached, the tactics of the weak against the strong evolved with technology. The Second Boer War in South Africa saw the Dutch settlers or Boers fighting against the British Empire. The Boers were excellent marksmen and expert horsemen. They organized themselves into mobile units called Commandos. They refused to fight the British in open battle and instead attacked railways and isolated garrisons. The British Army, with its rigid discipline and red coats, found itself outmaneuvered on the vast veldt. The British response to the Boer tactics was ruthless. Lord Kitchener initiated a scorched earth policy. He burned Boer farms and slaughtered livestock to deny the commandos food and shelter. He also rounded up Boer women and children and placed them in concentration camps where thousands died of disease and starvation. This brutal strategy eventually forced the Boers to surrender, but it came at a terrible moral cost to the British Empire. It demonstrated the extreme lengths a conventional power will go to defeat an irregular enemy. World War I is often remembered for the static trench warfare of the Western Front, but in the Middle East, a dynamic guerrilla war was unfolding. The British officer Thomas Edward Lawrence was sent to assist the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. Lawrence understood that the Arabs could not defeat the Turks in a conventional battle. He persuaded the Arab leaders to utilize their strengths, which were speed and knowledge of the desert. He proposed a strategy of attacking the Ottoman infrastructure. Character Bible: Thomas Edward Lawrence is a young British officer with fair skin and piercing blue eyes and messy blonde hair. He is dressed in traditional white Arab robes and a keffiyeh headscarf with a gold agal. He wears a curved dagger at his waist and carries a Lee Enfield rifle. He rides a camel and looks determined. Lawrence and the Arab fighters targeted the Hijaz Railway, which was the lifeline of the Ottoman army in Medina. They used explosives to destroy tracks and bridges and derail trains. These attacks forced the Turks to spread their troops thin along hundreds of miles of railway line. Lawrence described his strategy as turning the enemy into a mineral. By keeping the Turks static and defensive, the Arabs remained a vapor that could strike anywhere. The desert was their ocean and the camels were their ships. The most daring feat of the Arab revolt was the capture of the port city of Aqaba. The city was heavily defended from the sea, but its landward side faced a harsh and supposedly impassable desert. Lawrence and the Arab forces crossed this deadly terrain and attacked Aqaba from the rear. The Ottoman defenders were caught completely by surprise and surrendered. This victory provided a crucial supply port for the British and proved the effectiveness of irregular desert warfare. Lawrence became a legend, but the betrayal of Arab independence after the war left a bitter legacy. During World War II, guerrilla warfare played a critical role in resisting Nazi occupation. In the Soviet Union, partisan units operated behind German lines on a massive scale. These partisans were a mix of stranded Red Army soldiers and local civilians. They lived in the deep forests and swamps of Belarus and Ukraine. They ambushed German convoys and blew up trains and assassinated collaborators. The Germans were forced to divert significant security forces to protect their rear areas, which weakened their frontline strength. In France, the resistance worked to undermine the German occupation through sabotage and intelligence gathering. While they could not defeat the German army in battle, they prepared the ground for the Allied invasion. They cut telephone lines and destroyed rail tracks to delay German reinforcements heading to Normandy. The Jedburgh teams, which were small units of Allied special forces, dropped into France to coordinate and arm the resistance. This cooperation between conventional and irregular forces was key to the liberation of Europe. The Chinese Civil War and the war against Japan saw the rise of Mao Zedong, who theorized guerrilla warfare into a science. Mao wrote extensively on the subject and defined 3 phases of warfare. The first phase is organization and consolidation. The second is progressive expansion and guerrilla attacks. The third is the transition to conventional warfare to destroy the enemy. Mao emphasized that the guerrilla must move among the people as a fish swims in the sea. Without the support of the people, the guerrilla cannot survive. The theories of Mao were put to the test in the jungles of Vietnam. The Vietnam War was perhaps the most complex example of asymmetric warfare in the 20th century. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army fought against the United States in South Vietnam. The US possessed overwhelming firepower and air superiority. To counter this, the Viet Cong built vast networks of underground tunnels. The tunnels of Cu Cai allowed them to live and move and store supplies beneath the feet of the American soldiers. The jungle terrain of Vietnam neutralized much of the American technological advantage. Tanks and heavy vehicles struggled in the mud and dense foliage. The Viet Cong used booby traps and punji stakes and snipers to inflict constant casualties. They engaged American patrols at close range to negate the use of artillery and airstrikes. This was known as grabbing the enemy by the belt buckle. The goal was not to seize territory, but to inflict a psychological toll on the American troops and the public back home. The United States measured success by the body count of enemy dead, but this metric was flawed. The North Vietnamese were willing to absorb tremendous losses to achieve their goal of unification. General Giap, the commander of the North Vietnamese forces, understood that political will was more important than battlefield victories. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the American public turned against the conflict. The superpower was eventually forced to withdraw, not because it was defeated militarily, but because it had lost the political will to fight. Modern warfare continues to see the prevalence of asymmetric tactics. From the mountains of Afghanistan to the streets of urban conflict zones, irregular fighters challenge conventional armies. Improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, have become the signature weapon of the modern insurgent. These cheap and deadly devices negate the protection of expensive armored vehicles. The lesson remains the same. A determined force that adapts to its environment and refuses to fight on the terms of the enemy can withstand incredible pressure. The history of guerrilla warfare is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It is a brutal and often dirty form of combat where the lines between soldier and civilian are blurred. It requires immense endurance and sacrifice from those who wage it. For the weak against the strong, it is often the only option available. It proves that while technology and numbers are powerful, they are not always decisive. The will to resist and the creativity to adapt are weapons that no empire can fully suppress. As we look back at the figures of Francis Marion and the Spanish partisans and the diverse fighters of the 20th century, we see a common thread. They were all outmatched and outgunned, yet they found a way to fight back. They turned their weakness into strength and their terrain into a weapon. They remind us that history is not always written by the victors of great battles, but sometimes by the whispers in the shadows. The legacy of the guerrilla is the enduring power of asymmetric resistance.